Hello class, this is Mr. Biddle and welcome to our first digital input. Today's lecture is entitled Becoming Sedentary, First Neolithic Settlements. Let's begin with an overview of today's lesson. First, we will take a stroll down memory lane, reviewing some of the essential characteristics of Paleolithic humans. Then we will infer why these Paleolithic humans decided to stop being nomadic and settle in one location. And finally, we will discuss how they were able to stay put in one place using innovative irrigation techniques. So let's start by examining our previous unit of study. Around 2 million years ago, Homo habilis began using primitive stone tools to ensure their survival. The use of stone tools marks the beginning of the Stone Age, also known as the Paleolithic era. Now, consequently, humans did not learn to hunt with stone tools until a new species of human learned to innovate and create stone-tipped spears like you see here in the picture. Do you remember who these first definitive Stone Age hunters were? Yep, you guessed it, the Homo erectus. Now, of course, early humans like Homo erectus sustained themselves by hunting large animals while simultaneously gathering edible fruits and vegetables. Now, at the time, human life revolved around finding their next meal. Furthermore, every item a Paleolithic human possessed had to be lightweight and easy to move from one place to the next. Frankly, the hunter-gatherer way of life was not very stable. Hunting was dangerous, nearby plants were often scarce, and weather could be very unpredictable. Even though Paleolithic humans were master hunters, they had yet to master their environment. Which leads us to the next important point. Paleolithic humans were also nomadic, constantly on the move with their clan. Everybody had an important job in the clan, working for the greater good of the collective whole to ensure everybody's basic needs, such as food, water, and clothing, were being met. Typically, men in the clan would hunt large game, and women would gather nuts and berries. Women would also tend to the children while the men were away hunting. With this in mind, one could easily infer that nomadic clans were egalitarian, which means equal. Even though there would have been a clan leader who helped oversee the hunt, men and women both had vital roles to play to ensure survival. Eventually, some 2 million years after the invention of stone tools, the nomadic hunter-gatherer way of human life would evolve into the first permanent settlements. The first question historians ask is why? Why did nomadic people become sedentary? Simply put, nomadic hunters and gatherers found a region in the Fertile Crescent with an abundance of fish, wild grains, and drinking water. So much abundance, in fact, that the nomadic people decided to stay permanently. However, it must be stated that the early settlers had no clue how to actually grow crops yet. They simply gathered the grains, such as wheat and barley, to make bread. But how could bread make nomadic people want to stay put? Well, 1 acre of wheat could now produce half a ton of grain. A single harvest could now feed an entire family for a year. Finding and storing food became simple. Soon thereafter, these easily gathered grains became staples of the human diet. So storing and preserving these grains became essential for their survival. But where did they put their harvest? In their newly styled homes, of course. Yes, the first permanent homes were very simple structures made of sun-dried mud brick. In regards to storing surplus, these homes contained earthen pits in their homes that would store and preserve their extra food, their surplus. Now, these Neolithic refrigerators weren't the best way to preserve their surplus, but at least it was a beginning. Additionally, these homes were also much more durable, and they could withstand weather. And actually, you can actually see in the picture here, there would have been holes in the roofs for individuals to climb in and out of. Actually, people in these early towns would have used the roofs as sort of like streets. They would use the roofs to walk back and forth. Now, speaking of these dense communities, they were. Dense means very populated, very close together. Now, in general, the first communities, such as Catalhoyuk, Jericho, or Eridu, were quite dense. Homes were built right next to one another, so rather than a clan of 20 people living together, humans were now living in massive groups in the hundreds. Living in larger communities would certainly have its benefits and also create problems, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. Regardless, these communities still required a stable food supply, which existed through the gathering of wheat and barley. However, droughts and floods were a major concern. Humans had to find a more dependable way to feed their entire community. Undoubtedly, this need to feed really led to one of humankind's greatest discoveries: farming. It's still unclear how the first farms came to be. However, historians do concur that growing crops most likely began when people began experimenting with seeds that they gathered. Eventually, they figured out how to grow their own food by planting the seeds and watering them. This discovery marks the beginning of the agricultural revolution. On top of that, these same individuals discovered how to domesticate animals, and they figured out how to tame and breed them. Now pigs, sheep, goat, cattle could now all be kept in pens nearby to ensure that they had a fresh meat supply. No hunting was required anymore. For the first time in human history, we'd become masters of our domain. We controlled land and animal. Actually, there is a name for this revolutionary time in human history, and it's called the Neolithic era. Defined, the term Neolithic actually means New Stone Age, which means that the first farmers were still using stone tools to plant and harvest crops. But remember, even though Neolithic people controlled land and beast, they still could not control the weather. And yes, weather was and still is unpredictable, and farmers had to find innovative ways to protect their land and preserve their way of life. How, you ask? Well, irrigation, of course. Now, irrigation simply means moving water from one location to the next. With that being said, you can imagine that being an ancient farmer would have been tough. Carrying buckets of water would have been nearly impossible. So they had to find better ways of moving the water. And one of the first ways they found was using canals. Now, with the help of gravity, water can now find its way to their farms to feed their animals and nourish their crops. No more carrying water by hand. Unfortunately, these were done by hand, so digging these canals was still back-breaking work. To top it off, canals required a regular upkeep and oversight to ensure that the flow of water was maintained throughout the year. In addition to canals, farmers learned to store water by creating reservoirs. Reservoirs are essentially man-made lakes. Now, farmers would use them if their crops or animals needed more water than the canals were providing. Reservoirs were essential because there was very little rainfall in the Fertile Crescent, and the flow of water was very often unpredictable. The flooding wasn't all that bad to the first sedentary people. In truth, Neolithic farmers relied on floods to sustain their crops more than anything else because it provided not only water, but very nutrient-rich silt. Now, indeed, flooding did happen, and it happened a lot. You see, every spring the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would overflow due to the snowmelt in the northern mountains. These floods could be devastating, even wipe out an entire village. But they were also necessary because, like I said before, they brought fresh water and nutrient-rich soil. So the people prepared for these floods. They learned to build walls to block water and control the flow, like you see here, by building dams. Finally, the last irrigation technique I'll be talking about is levees. Now, even though dams and reservoirs were both excellent inventions, they were not really foolproof, and actually also they were very difficult to build. So farmers found ways of creating what's called a levee, which is an earthen wall near their farms to protect their crops. All in all, these innovations in engineering really helped to ensure that these first Neolithic settlements had an ample supply of fresh water for their crops and their animals. So let's review. We began by taking a walk down memory lane, reviewing the lives of humans who lived during the Old Stone Age, also known as the Paleolithic era. Then we discussed why these Paleolithic humans decided to stay put. Furthermore, we examined how they were able to survive in one place with the invention of farming, often called the agricultural revolution. Now, let me be clear about this. These first settlers who used farming are called Neolithic people, or New Stone Age. And finally, we learned that irrigation techniques such as canals, dams, levees, and reservoirs help Neolithic settlements better control the flow of water. So next time, we will actually be exploring how these settlements evolved into thriving civilizations. And then after that, we'll talk about how these civilizations grew into city-states and eventually empires. So for now, there you have it. Remember, class, this is just one chapter from the greatest story ever told, our story. Until next time.